In 1851, an Ohio mill town produces ordinary flour sacks. But one woman, a mill laundress named Patience Cole, has been stitching coded thread marks into their seams for 6 years. Each mark is a waypoint, a warning, or a signal on a route that no abolitionist society ever recorded. When a Pinkerton agent begins investigating the mill, Patience must move faster than the system closing around her, while the evidence of everything she built sits folded on a shelf in plain sight. The sack on the shelf. The object sat on a shelf in the Ohio Historical Archive for 61 years before anyone looked at it closely. It was a flour sack, rough woven cotton 16 inches by 22, bleached to a dull cream by decades of storage. A handwritten tag tied to its drawstring read simply, Hartwell Mill, Cuyahoga County, 1851. Condition: fair. No donor name, no acquisition note, no record of how it had arrived. An archivist named Leonard Marsh cataloged it in September 1912 as part of a bulk donation of textile goods from a shuttered mill property, assigned it the accession number OH7741T, and placed it in a flat storage drawer next to 3 bolt ends of wool broadcloth and a leather apron. He did not examine the seams. Nobody would for another 11 years. In 1923, a young graduate student from Western Reserve University named Harriet Voss was assigned to inventory the textile collection as part of a broader survey of pre-Civil War manufacturing artifacts. She had been given 3 weeks and a cardboard box of index cards. She was not looking for anything in particular. On her second day, she pulled OH7741T from its drawer, unfolded it on the examination table, and noticed something that stopped her hand in mid-motion. Along the left inner seam, the seam most people never touch, the seam that disappears when the sack is full, there were small stitched marks. Not decorative, not accidental. They ran in a deliberate sequence. Cross, loop, double knot, space, single thread, pulled through. Cross, loop, single knot, space, double thread. She counted them. She counted them again. There were 47 marks in total, distributed across 3 seams in a pattern that could not have been random. Harriet Voss set down her pencil and sat very still for a long moment. Then she wrote one word on her index card. Intentional. That word would take her 6 years to fully understand. It would lead her to a name that appeared in no census, no church register, and no abolitionist society record in Cuyahoga County. It would lead her to a network that moved an estimated 211 people northward across Ohio between the years 1845 and 1857. A network whose entire operational infrastructure had been encoded in plain cotton thread, sewn into objects so ordinary that no patrol, no marshal, and no Pinkerton man had ever thought to open a seam. The Hartwell Flour Mill stood on the west bank of the Cuyahoga River in a town called Grafton Crossing. Population 1,140 in the 1850 federal census. It was not a large operation by the standards of the industrial Northeast. The mill employed 31 workers at its peak in 1852. 12 men on the grinding floor, 4 in the loading yard, 6 in the cooperage attaching iron hoops to barrels, 3 in the weighing room, 2 drivers, 2 office clerks, and 4 laundresses who worked a separate wooden outbuilding behind the main structure. The laundresses washed the grain sacks. Every day, empty sacks came back from delivery routes, covered in flour dust, mildew stains. and the grime of wagon beds and warehouse floors. Every day, the laundresses soaked them, scrubbed them on ribbed wooden boards, rinsed them in the river water that ran through a stone channel behind the building, wrung them by hand, and hung them to dry on lines strung between the outbuilding and the smokehouse wall. It was exhausting work. It was invisible work. It was exactly the kind of work that placed a woman in unremarkable proximity to every sack that passed through the mill, before it was filled, after it was emptied, over and over across the weeks and months and years of a flour mill's ordinary operation. And it was the kind of work that nobody watched very carefully, because there was nothing in it that anyone imagined could be worth watching. Patience Cole had worked as a laundress at the Hartwell Mill since the spring of 1845. She was 31 years old when she started. A free black woman who had come to Grafton Crossing from Lancaster County in Pennsylvania with a letter of character from a Quaker household and the practical skills of a woman who had been laundering commercially since she was 14. She rented a single room from a widow named Agnes Pratt on the east side of town, 2 blocks from the mill. She kept to herself, attended the African Methodist Episcopal congregation in the neighboring town of Ridgewood 6 miles away, and was known in Grafton Crossing primarily for the quality of her work and the steadiness of her temperament. The mill owner, a man named Ezekiel Hartwell, described her in an 1848 account ledger entry as reliable, quiet, and without complaint. He meant it as high praise. He had no idea what she was doing with the sacks. To understand what Patience Cole built, you first need to understand what the flour sack actually was, not as a container, but as an object in motion. A single Hartwell mill sack completed an average of 14 full cycles in a year. It left the mill loaded with ground wheat, traveled by wagon to one of 37 delivery stops spread across a 60-mile radius of Cuyahoga County, was emptied by a storekeep or farm household, and then returned to the mill on the next scheduled wagon run, usually within 3 to 5 days. In a single year, a sack might pass through the hands of a German immigrant farmer in Medina County, a Baptist minister's wife in Elyria, a tavern keeper south of Oberlin, and a free black community near Wellington before it came back to the laundry outbuilding in Patience Cole's hands. Every return was a communication. Every departure was a message sent forward. The code she developed was not written down anywhere. It existed entirely in thread, in the deliberate placement of knots and loops along seams that nobody examined. Harriet Voss spent 3 years attempting to reconstruct its logic before she identified 9 distinct symbols. A simple cross-stitch marking a safe house, a loop-over-loop sequence indicating a route was clear, a tight double-knot warning of patrol activity within 2 days' travel, a single pulled thread, nearly invisible, requiring a fingernail or a pin to feel, signaling that the route had been compromised entirely and should not be used. There were symbols for water sources, symbols for distances, symbols for the number of people currently sheltered at a given location, and one symbol Voss was never able to decode with certainty, a triple-looped thread that appeared on only 4 of the 47 marks, clustered in the 3rd seam near the sack's bottom hem, and which she believed, based on its placement, indicated something about the timing of the next departure north. The entire system was silent, weightless, and embedded in an object that traveled legally across the state of Ohio on a flour merchant's delivery wagon, inspected by nobody, suspicious to no one. By 1851, the system had been operating for 6 years. In that time, Patience Cole had established contact with at least 11 safe house keepers across the county, most of them free black families, and a small number of sympathetic white Quaker and Methodist households. She had never written them a letter. She had never met most of them in person. Everything that needed to be communicated between them traveled in cotton thread, hidden in a seam, carried on a wagon that left the Hartwell Mill yard every Tuesday and Friday morning at 7:30. The communication network functioned because of the flour. Not despite it, because of it. A bag of Hartwell flour was a normal, expected legal object in virtually every household, farm, and establishment in a 60-mile radius. Its arrival required no explanation. Its presence aroused no curiosity. A marshal executing a search under the Fugitive Slave Act might look under floorboards, inside woodpiles, beneath haystacks and barns. He would not open a flour sack and examine its inner seam with a pin. The hiding place was not spatial, it was categorical. The message hid inside an object so ordinary that the human mind refused to see it as a container for anything at all. This was Patience Cole's essential insight, and it was one that no scholar of the Underground Railroad in Ohio had documented prior to Harriet Voss's investigation in 1923. The 17 accounts of Ohio Freedom Networks, published between 1864 and 1920, described hiding places, conductors, station houses, and routes. Not one described a communication system. The silence is not an accident of history. The silence was the system. In October of 1851, the Ohio Fugitive Slave Act enforcement was intensifying. 3 months earlier, the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had reached its first full year of implementation, and slave catchers operating with federal warrants had successfully recovered 14 freedom seekers in northern Ohio alone. In Cuyahoga County, a private investigative firm from Cincinnati, employed by a consortium of Kentucky slaveholders, had stationed 2 agents in the region. Their names were Thomas Reardon and a man recorded only as Connolly. They were not Pinkerton men. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency would not be formally established for another year. But they operated on Pinkerton-style methods: quiet observation, informant cultivation, commercial cover. Reardon had established himself as a purchasing agent for a dry goods concern in Cleveland. He traveled the county roads. He visited stores. He listened to what people said in front of him, because people rarely remember to guard their speech in front of a man doing something as unremarkable as examining bolts of calico and ordering barrels of molasses. In the second week of October, Reardon stopped at the Hartwell Mill on the pretext of pricing grain for a merchant client in Cuyahoga Falls. He spent 40 minutes in the front office with one of the clerks. He accepted a cup of coffee. He looked through the mill's front window into the loading yard, where the wagon teams were being hitched for the Tuesday departure. Then he asked, as if it had occurred to him idly, about the mill's delivery route. The clerk told him everything. 37 stops, every Tuesday and Friday, all of Cuyahoga County and parts of Medina and Lorain. The whole geography of the network that Patience Cole had spent 6 years building into the seams of the returning sacks. The man described it in the time it took to finish a cup of coffee. Reardon left the mill, mounted his horse, and made a note in his ledger. He was not certain of anything yet, but something in the pattern of the delivery route, the specific combination of stops, the regularity of the schedule, overlapped in his mind with information he had received from two of his county informants. He would need more time. He would need to watch the wagon. In the laundry outbuilding behind the main mill building, Patience Cole was at that moment wringing a sack on the wooden board, her hands moving through the motions she had repeated 10,000 times. She did not know that a man on a horse had just departed with the shape of her network in his notebook. She finished the sack, held it up to the gray October light to check the weave, and carried it inside to dry. The next Friday departure was 3 days away. She had 4 sacks to finish before then, and in each one in the inner seam where nobody looked, she had a message to send forward. 3 days was exactly the margin she did not know she was running out of. What the thread knows, there are 9 ways to lie with a needle. Patience Cole had invented all of them. The first symbol she ever stitched, in the spring of 1845, 6 months after she arrived in Grafton Crossing, was the simplest one: a cross stitch. 4 threads forming an X, placed 1 inch from the bottom corner of an inner seam. It meant, "This house is safe." She had used it on a sack going to a woman named Ruth Elias, a free black midwife who lived on a farm road 4 miles south of Elyria, who had told Patience in a brief conversation at the AME congregation in Ridgewood that she had room in her root cellar and courage enough to use it. The cross-stitch was a question. Ruth Elias received the sack, felt the seam with her thumb, understood immediately, and 3 weeks later sent the sack back with the same cross-stitch reproduced in a slightly different thread. Her own needle, her own confirmation. A language between 2 women, negotiated in silence, ratified in cotton, and invisible to everyone who had handled the sack in between. By 1851, the language had grown to 9 symbols, each one developed in response to a specific operational need that the network had encountered. The loop over loop, 2 threads crossing and wrapping back, had been added in 1847 after a freedom seeker named James was nearly discovered at a station house because nobody had been able to communicate in time that the route northward was clear. The tight double knot warning of patrol activity came out of a crisis in February 1848 when 2 men sheltering in a Medina County barn missed a 3-day window to move because no message had reached them fast enough. The single pulled thread, the compromise signal, had cost Patience 2 weeks of sleepless testing before she was satisfied that it was invisible enough. It had to be felt, not seen. A casual search of the seam by someone who didn't know what they were looking for would pass over it completely. Only a person running their fingernails slowly along the full length of the inner seam, expecting a signal, would catch the slight irregularity in the tension where 1 thread had been drawn fractionally tighter than the rest. 9 symbols, 47 marks across 3 seams. In 6 years, not one had been intercepted, read, or reported. The sacks themselves were the key to the system's invisibility, and Patience Cole understood their properties the way a cartographer understands terrain. She had washed them for 6 years. She knew exactly how the cotton weave aged, how the threads loosened at the corners after 30 cycles, how bleach affected the thread color at different dilutions, how a sack that had been stored wet developed a particular stiffness along the seam that made embroidered marks slightly harder to detect by touch. She timed her stitching accordingly. Marks placed on a freshly washed, damp sack before the cotton dried to its final tension, set into the weave differently than marks placed on dry fabric. The fibers contracted around the thread as the sack dried, embedding the stitch more deeply, making it harder to see from the outside and harder to feel unless you press the seam directly between finger and thumb with deliberate intent. She also understood the flow of the sacks through the mill's operations in precise detail. Out of the 37 delivery stops on the Hartwell route, she had active contacts at 11. The remaining 26 stops were ordinary commercial customers, households, general stores, taverns, a school, who received their flour, used it, and returned the sack with no awareness that they were participating in anything other than a standard commercial arrangement. The genius of this distribution was its statistical camouflage. If someone were to examine a random selection of returned sacks from the Hartwell route, the probability of selecting one of the 11 active sacks over the 26 inactive ones was less than 30%. Even among the active sacks, only those currently carrying a live message would show all 9 symbols populated. Most of the time, a sack going to an active station carried only 1 or 2 marks, a route clear signal, or a simple safe house confirmation, which would be nearly impossible to distinguish from accidental thread damage without knowing the code. Harriet Voss calculated in her 1929 doctoral dissertation that the total combined thread used across all 47 marks on the sack she examined at the Ohio Historical Archive amounted to approximately 11 inches of cotton thread. 11 inches. Enough to encode the operational status of a freedom network moving human beings across 60 miles of territory. The first serious failure came in the summer of 1848, and it nearly ended everything. A man named Calvin Pruitt worked as a drayman for the Hartwell Mill, driving the Tuesday route. He was 26 years old, the son of a local farmer, and by every account, a decent and unremarkable young man with no particular political opinions. He was also, as Patience Cole did not know until it was nearly too late, running a quiet side commerce in information. Not ideological betrayal, not slave catching for conviction or principle. Simply money. A Kentucky agent working the northern Ohio corridor had approached Pruitt in a Medina County tavern in March of 1848 and offered him $2 for any information about households along his delivery route that seemed to receive visitors at unusual hours or shelter unusual numbers of people. Pruitt, who earned $7 a month driving for Hartwell, accepted. For 4 months, Pruitt observed and reported. He noticed that a farmhouse near Wellington, one of Patience's active stations, run by a free black couple named Hiram and Cecilia Granger, seemed to receive callers on Thursday evenings that he did not recognize from the regular community. He reported this. By July, the Kentucky agent had enough information to pass to a federal marshal in Cleveland. On the 14th of July, 1848, the marshal arrived at the Granger farm with a warrant and 2 deputies. What saved the 3 freedom seekers currently sheltering in the Granger root cellar was not heroism. It was the tight double knot. 4 days before the marshal's arrival, Patience had received information through the AME congregation network. A whispered warning passed through 2 intermediaries. that a drayman on one of the county routes was carrying information to agents. She did not know which drayman, she did not know which route, but she stitched the double knot warning into the seam of every Friday sack that week, including the one going to Wellington. Cecilia Granger received her flour on Saturday morning, felt the seam before she moved the sack inside, and that same afternoon moved all 3 sheltering people to a secondary location 6 miles north. When the marshal arrived on Monday, the root cellar held nothing but empty burlap and a half cord of firewood. The marshal found nothing. Pruitt was dismissed from Hartwell's employ 2 weeks later for unrelated reasons. A broken axle he had failed to report, and disappeared from the county records. The Granger station was dormant for 3 months, while patients assessed the exposure, then reopened with a new verification protocol. A second signal, a small loop sewn into the exterior hem rather than the inner seam, confirming that the sack had not been tampered with in transit. That loop, the 10th mark in a system officially built around 9, was never formally cataloged by Harriet Voss. It appears on OH7741T, but Voss classified it as a manufacturing irregularity. The error is understandable. The mark was only 3 millimeters long. The second serious failure came in January of 1849, and it cost patients considerably more. A station house in Medina County, operated by a white Methodist farmer named Absalom Pierce, who had been part of the network for 2 years, was searched under the Fugitive Slave Act by a county sheriff acting on information from an anonymous letter. Pierce was not home. His wife was. The search found nothing. The 2 freedom seekers currently sheltered there had been moved to a secondary location the previous day, again because of a warning encoded in a returned flour sack. But the sheriff's visit meant the Pierce station was permanently burned. Absalom Pierce, frightened by the proximity of the search, withdrew from the network. His farm was one of 3 waypoints on what patients had designated as the Northern Corridor, the route that eventually connected to Lake Erie and the crossing to Canada. Losing Pierce meant losing the corridor's second waypoint. The route had to be abandoned entirely while patients identified and verified a replacement. That process took 4 months. During those 4 months, 18 people who might otherwise have moved through the Northern Corridor were rerouted through a longer, slower path that added 2 days and an additional 60 miles to the crossing. 3 of them were recaptured. Their names do not appear in any record that Harriet Voss was able to locate. Patience Cole did not abandon the system after these failures. She extended it. The double knot warning received a secondary variant, a knot placed 2 inches further along the seam than standard, indicating not just patrol activity, but patrol activity specifically on the Northern Corridor. She developed a protocol for retiring compromised stations cleanly, using the single pulled thread as a signal to adjacent stations in the network that a given route was dark and should not be referenced until further notice. She also began a quiet process that Harriet Voss would later call station redundancy, ensuring that every critical waypoint on every active route had at least one backup location that could absorb its function within 48 hours. This required expanding the network from 11 contacts to 16. It required 16 separate verification protocols, 16 sacks, 16 sets of marked seams, 16 people who needed to learn to read cotton thread with a fingernail without anyone in their household noticing them do it. She managed it in under 8 months, entirely through the flower route, entirely in thread. By October 1851, the network was at its most sophisticated and also at its most exposed. 16 active stations, 4 operational corridors, an estimated 31 people currently in transit or sheltered at various points along the routes, and 2 investigators, Reardon and Connolly, moving through the county in commercial cover, asking questions that Patience Cole did not yet know were being asked. She was aware, in a general sense, of increased enforcement pressure. The passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act had changed the practical reality of every freedom network in the Ohio corridor. Before 1850, a freedom seeker who reached a free state had meaningful legal protection. After 1850, federal marshals could enforce warrants for recapture anywhere in the country, and private agents operating with those warrants had full legal authority to enter properties and compel the assistance of local authorities. The fine for anyone caught aiding a freedom seeker had risen to $1,000, more than most Cuyahoga County workers earned in 4 years. Several networks operating in the region had gone dormant rather than risk it. 2 conductors, Patience knew by name, had moved north to Canada themselves. She had not gone dormant, she had gone deeper. The modification she introduced in the summer of 1851 was the most technically complex thing she had ever added to the code. She had noticed, across 6 years of washing and handling the sacks, that no one, not the mill workers, not the drivers, not the storekeeps at delivery stops, ever paid attention to the thread color used for mending repairs along the seams. When a sack developed a small tear, the laundresses mended it with whatever thread was at hand. White, off-white, gray, occasionally a faint yellow from an older spool. The color variation was random and unremarkable. A mended sack with 3 colors of thread along its seams looked exactly like what it was, an old, much-used sack that had been repaired several times by different hands. Patience began using thread color as a second layer of the code. White thread for a symbol meant the information was current, verified within the last 7 days. Off-white thread meant the information was conditional, reliable but unconfirmed by a second source. Gray thread meant the information was old, more than 2 weeks without update, use with caution. The system was invisible to anyone who did not already know the first layer of the code, because without knowing which thread colors carried meaning, the color variation looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. Random mending. 47 marks. 9 symbols. 3 thread colors. The amount of information embedded in 11 inches of cotton, parsed by a set of hands at the other end of a flower route, was now equivalent to a detailed operational briefing. Safe house confirmed. Current. Northern corridor clear. Conditional. Patrol activity near Ridgewood Road. Old information. Verify before use. Harriet Voss, when she finally decoded this second layer in 1927, sat in the archive reading room for a long time before she wrote anything down. In her notes from that session, now held at Case Western Reserve University, she wrote a single sentence. She built a telegraph out of laundry. On the 17th of October, 1851, Thomas Reardon made the observation that began to unravel the protection that invisibility had provided. He had been watching the Hartwell Mill wagon for 11 days. Not obviously, he was careful about that. He had mapped the Tuesday and Friday routes by following at a distance on horseback, noting the stops, the timing, the households that received deliveries. He had cross-referenced the stops against his informant reports and the information he had already compiled about known or suspected Freedom Network activity in the county. The overlap was not conclusive. It was suggestive. 17 of the 37 delivery stops were in areas where he had received at least one report of unusual nighttime activity, unexpected visitors, or unexplained food consumption at a household in the past 18 months. 17 out of 37 was not evidence of anything, but it was a shape that looked, to a trained investigator's eye, too consistent to be coincidence. What he needed was something physical, a pattern in the sacks themselves, or in the handling of them, that he could bring to a federal marshal as probable cause for a search. On the morning of October 17th, Reardon arrived at the Hartwell Mill yard on the pretext of following up on his grain pricing inquiry. He arrived early, before the Friday wagon had been loaded. He spent 20 minutes in the loading yard, ostensibly reviewing a list of prices with the yard foreman. During those 20 minutes, he watched the laundry outbuilding. He watched a woman carry a stack of clean sacks from the outbuilding to the loading dock, set them down, and return inside. He watched the yard workers load the sacks onto the wagon without examining them. He watched the woman come back outside to retrieve a sack she had forgotten, check it against a count in her hand, and return it to the pile. The checking motion, her hand moving along the sack's seam before she added it to the stack, lasted approximately 3 seconds. Nothing about it was dramatic. It looked exactly like what any careful laundress might do, checking the seam integrity of a mended sack before sending it back into service. Reardon noted it anyway. He noted the woman's approximate age, her appearance, her position at the mill. He noted that she was the only worker in the loading yard who touched the sacks before they were loaded, and that she touched them along the seam. He did not yet know what he was looking at, but he knew how to find out. On the following Tuesday, October 21st, Reardon intercepted one of the returning Hartwell sacks at a delivery stop in Medina County. The storekeep there, a man named Foley who owed Reardon a favor from an earlier piece of business, handed it over without question in exchange for the promise of $2. Reardon took the sack to his room at a tavern in Grafton Crossing, sat down at the table with a candle, and began examining the seams. He found the marks in 11 minutes. He could not read them. He had no context, no key, no knowledge of what the symbols meant, or how the color variation functioned. What he had was proof of intent. No natural process of laundering or ordinary use produced deliberate cross stitches and looped thread formations in a consistent pattern along an inner seam. Someone had put them there on purpose. Someone who handled these sacks before they left the mill. He already knew who touched the sacks before they left the mill. He spent the rest of the evening writing a letter to a federal marshal in Cleveland, describing what he had found and requesting authorization to proceed with an interview and search. He folded the letter, sealed it, and set the flour sack on the table beside his candle. In the candlelight, the seam marks cast tiny shadows. Cross, loop, double knot, cross, loop. A sequence running down 3 inches of cotton thread that he could see but not understand. Patience Cole was 4 miles away, in her room on the east side of Grafton Crossing, stitching the marks for the next Friday's sacks by the light of her own candle. She had 31 people moving through 4 corridors and a network she had spent 6 years building by hand. She had no way of knowing that a man in a tavern room 4 miles away had just held the entire architecture of it in his hands. She had until Friday morning. She had 4 sacks left to finish. She had no idea the window had already closed. 11 inches of cotton. Friday morning arrived, the way danger always does in quiet places, without announcement, wrapped in the ordinary. The Hartwell Mill yard was no different at 6 o'clock on October 24th, 1851, than it had been on any of the 1100 mornings before it. The dray horses stood in their traces, breath steaming in the cold air. The yard foreman moved between the wagon and the loading dock with his clipboard. 2 workers carried crates from the grain storage. The river ran cold and gray behind the building, the same as always. Patience Cole had been in the laundry outbuilding since 5:15, finishing the last 2 sacks by the light of a tallow lamp before the October dawn made it unnecessary. She was not hurrying. Hurrying attracted attention. She worked at the same pace she always worked. Steady, methodical, her hands moving through the seams with the particular economy of motion that comes from 10,000 repetitions of the same task. She was on the 3rd seam of the final sack when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard that did not belong to the mill. She did not stop stitching. She did not look up. She pulled the thread through the last mark. A loop over loop in off-white thread, the conditional route clear signal for the Wellington station, and bit the thread clean. Then she folded the sack, set it on top of the finished pile, and picked up the next piece of ordinary work. A torn canvas apron belonging to one of the grinding floor men, waiting in the mending basket since Wednesday. She threaded a needle with plain gray cotton and began mending the tear in the pocket seam. When the door of the outbuilding opened 4 minutes later, she was bent over the apron, stitching a patch that would outlast the man who wore it. Thomas Reardon stepped into the outbuilding with a man she did not recognize. Younger, thicker, through the shoulders, wearing a county sheriff's deputy badge on his coat. Reardon looked around the outbuilding with the deliberate visual economy of a man who had been inside places like this before on professional business. He looked at the tubs. He looked at the drying lines. He looked at the stack of finished sacks on the shelf beside the door. Then he looked at Patience Cole. "You're the laundress," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. She did not put down the apron. What followed lasted 40 minutes, and Harriet Voss was able to reconstruct most of it from 2 sources: a deposition given by the deputy sheriff, a man named Cyrus Hollis, in an unrelated case 2 years later, in which he referenced the October 1851 mill interview as context for his familiarity with certain investigative procedures, and a single page of notes in Reardon's own hand, found in 1961 in a box of miscellaneous documents donated to the Cincinnati Historical Society by the estate of a collector who had purchased them at auction in 1934. Reardon's notes are dry and professional. They describe an interview subject who was cooperative, calm, and completely unrevealing. She answered every question directly. She had laundered flour sacks at the Hartwell Mill for 6.5 years. She washed them, mended them, dried them, and returned them to the loading dock. She had no knowledge of anything unusual about any of the sacks or any of the delivery stops. She could not explain the marks in the seam of the sack Reardon produced and laid on the table in front of her, because she mended many sacks and could not remember the specifics of any particular one. Thread ends sometimes caught during the washing process and tangled. She had seen marks like that before and had always assumed they were the result of mechanical damage on the delivery wagons. Reardon watched her say all of this. He watched her hands, which held the canvas apron without tension. He watched her face, which was attentive and cooperative and told him nothing. He had interviewed experienced assemblers before, men who had practiced their stories for weeks. He could not find a seam in her account to put a nail in. He asked to examine the sacks on the shelf. "Of course," she said, and gestured toward them without standing up. He examined all 7 sacks on the shelf. He found nothing. He found nothing because the 4 active sacks, the ones carrying live messages for the Friday route, were already on the loading dock, placed there by Patience Cole's own hands at 5:50 that morning, 40 minutes before Reardon's horse entered the yard. They had been loaded onto the wagon while Reardon was tying his horse at the mill office entrance. By the time he was standing in the outbuilding with his deputy and his recovered sack, the Tuesday wagon was pulling out of the mill yard with 4 messages traveling inside its load, heading to 4 stations on 4 corridors, carrying information about route conditions and shelter availability and patrol warnings that 31 people were depending on. Patience Cole hadn't known Reardon was coming on that specific morning. She hadn't known about the letter to the federal marshal, or the intercepted sack, or the 11 minutes it had taken Reardon to find the marks. What she had known, since the 2nd week of October, through a chain of information passed at the AME congregation, and through a free black barber in Grafton Crossing, who heard things from the men whose hair he cut, was that an investigator was watching the mill's wagon routes. She had known it for 12 days. She had spent those 12 days making 12 days' worth of calculated decisions about what to put on the loading dock before anyone arrived, and what to keep in the outbuilding for examination. She had not known the exact morning. She had planned for every morning. Reardon left the outbuilding with nothing. He spoke to Ezekiel Hartwell in the mill office for 20 minutes, asking about the laundress's background and conduct. Hartwell told him she was reliable, quiet, and without complaint. Reardon noted this in his ledger, along with a personal assessment he wrote in the margin in smaller handwriting. Subject: composed. Denies all. No evidence of specific operational knowledge. Recommend continued surveillance of route stops rather than mill staff. He was right to recommend surveillance of the route stops. He was right that the evidence was in the route, not in the mill. What he could not have known, what took Harriet Voss 6 years to establish, and what remained unknown to every investigator, every marshal, and every slave catcher who operated in Cuyahoga County between 1845 and 1857, was that by the time any surveillance of the route stops could have been organized and implemented, the messages had already arrived. The loop-over-loop in off-white thread had been felt by Cecilia Granger's thumb at a kitchen table in Wellington before noon on Friday. The double knot warning had reached a station house near Ridgewood before supper time. The network had already moved. Thomas Reardon left Grafton Crossing on the 28th of October, 1851, 4 days after the interview in the laundry outbuilding. His letter to the federal marshal had produced an acknowledgement, but no immediate action. The marshal's office was occupied with a higher priority case involving a documented conductor in Sandusky County, and Reardon's evidence, which amounted to a set of unreadable seam marks and an inconclusive interview with a composed laundress, was insufficient to obtain a search warrant. Without a warrant, without a cooperative local sheriff, and without a second observation of the specific behavior he had documented, Reardon had nothing to hold him in Grafton Crossing. He billed his Kentucky clients for 17 days of field work and recommended continued monitoring of the Hartwell route by a local informant. The recommendation was not acted on. The Kentucky clients, facing mounting costs and limited results across multiple Ohio investigations, reduced their northern Ohio operation significantly in the spring of 1852. The network ran for 6 more years. Between October 1851 and the spring of 1857, when Patience Cole left Grafton Crossing, the reason for her departure is not recorded, but Harriet Voss believed it was connected to the failing health of Agnes Pratt, her landlady, who died in March of that year. The Hartwell route carried an estimated 163 additional people northward through the 4 corridors. Combined with the numbers from the preceding 6 years, Voss's total estimate stood at 211, though she was careful to note that this figure was conservative, derived only from the cases she could partially corroborate through secondary sources. The true number she wrote in her dissertation was almost certainly higher. After Patience Cole left, the network appears to have gone dormant within 6 months. The coded marks on returned sacks stopped appearing. Several of the active stations closed or changed hands. By 1858, the Hartwell mill had changed ownership. Ezekiel Hartwell sold the operation to a Cleveland grain merchant and retired to a farm in Cuyahoga County. The laundry outbuilding burned in a fire of unknown origin in the winter of 1859, destroying whatever physical evidence might have remained in its walls or floors. The mill itself was demolished in 1891 to make way for a railroad siding. Patience Cole disappears from the documentary record after 1857. Harriet Voss spent 11 years searching for her. Through census records, church registers, cemetery records, Freedmen's Bureau files, Canadian immigration records, and the personal papers of every abolitionist contact she could identify in the northern Ohio and southern Ontario corridor. She found one possible match: a woman named P. Cole, listed in an 1860 Canadian census record for a township in Ontario. Occupation listed as seamstress, age given as 46. Voss could not confirm the identification with certainty. The record lists no place of birth, no prior residence, no next of kin. A seamstress in Ontario in 1860. It is the kind of ending that history hands you when it has decided not to give you a proper one. The suppression of Patience Cole's story was not a dramatic act of institutional erasure. It was something quieter and in some ways more complete. She was never recorded in the first place. The 17 published accounts of Ohio Underground Railroad networks produced between 1864 and 1920 were written overwhelmingly by white abolitionists, former conductors of established organizations, and ministers who had participated in the network's most visible and documented activities. These accounts privileged the recordable, the formal safe house with a known address, the conductor whose name appeared in church records and correspondence, the dramatic rescue that generated a newspaper report. They were not wrong to record what they recorded. They simply did not record what left no paper trail, because the entire operational value of what Patience Cole had built was that it left no paper trail. The silence was the system, and the system was too good to survive into the historical record intact. When Harriet Voss submitted her doctoral dissertation to Western Reserve University in 1929, she titled it Thread and Cotton, a study of nonverbal communication systems in the Ohio Freedom Network, 1845 to 1857. The dissertation committee approved it with distinction. It was published in a limited academic edition of 200 copies in 1931. It received 3 reviews in scholarly journals, all respectful, none wide. The copy held at the Ohio Historical Archive is the one Voss herself donated in 1935. It has been checked out 9 times in 90 years. The flour sack, accession number OH-7741-T, remains in the archive's textile collection. It has been digitized and a high-resolution scan is available through the archive's online portal. The scan is clear enough to see the marks along the inner seam, 47 in total, distributed across 3 seams in 3 colors of thread: cross, loop, double knot, loop over loop, and the 4 marks in the 3rd seam near the bottom hem that Harriet Voss could never fully decode. The triple looped thread that she classified as possibly indicating departure timing, possibly indicating something else entirely, possibly meaning something that only 2 people in the world had ever known how to read, and both of them are long past telling. The archive catalog entry for OH-7741-T still reads, Flour Sack, Hartwell Mill, Cuyahoga County, 1851. Condition fair. Donor unknown. No name. After 172 years, the object that carried the names and routes and warnings of 211 people has no name attached to it. The donor field is blank. The acquisition note is missing. The woman who built the language it speaks is listed in exactly one possible record, 300 miles away, in a country she may or may not have reached, in a census that recorded her occupation as seamstress without irony and her origins as unknown. 11 inches of cotton thread, 9 symbols, 1 name that history filed under unknown and left there for a century and a half. There is one final thing Harriet Voss recorded in her 1929 dissertation, a detail she placed in a footnote, almost as an afterthought, as though she was not entirely sure what to do with it. In the course of her research, Voss had located a retired mill worker named Elijah Cross, then 83 years old, who had worked as a laborer at the Hartwell Mill from 1849 to 1854. She interviewed him in the summer of 1924 at a rest home in Elyria, Ohio. He was lucid, she noted, though his memory of specific dates was unreliable. He remembered the mill clearly, the grinding floor, the river behind the building, the smell of grain dust in summer. He remembered the laundresses. He remembered Patience Cole specifically because she was, in his words, the only person at the mill who never seemed to be in a hurry and never seemed to be idle. He said he had sometimes watched her from the yard when she came out with the finished sacks. He said she always checked the seams before she set them on the loading dock, always ran her fingers along the seam before she let the sack go. Voss asked him if he had ever thought that was unusual. He considered the question for a moment. No, he said, she was a laundress. That's what they do. They check the seams. He paused. But she always looked, I don't know how to say it, she always looked like she was listening. Like the sack was telling her something back. Harriet Voss wrote this down in her footnote and did not comment on it further. She did not need to. The image is complete without commentary. A woman in a loading yard on a cold Ohio morning, running her thumb along a cotton seam, her face attentive and still, reading a language that no one else in the yard could hear, sending it forward, waiting for it to return. The wagon pulls out of the yard. The river runs behind the building. The sack travels 60 miles and comes back. She checks the seam. She listens.